My name is Mary Collins, and I'm 68 years old. I live in a quiet neighborhood in Ohio, where the smell of fresh-cut grass mingles with the aroma of coffee that I still brew every morning at exactly 7:30. Some habits never change, even when everything else in your life has been turned upside down. If I told you this story, you might never look at certain people the same way again. You know when you believe in something so deeply that you give your whole life, your family, your dreams, everything to it, only to discover you were living a lie. A lie so profound that when you try to speak the truth, they call you crazy, rebellious, possessed by demons. Hello, my dear friends. Today, I want to share with you a story I've kept buried in the deepest part of my heart for over 20 years. A story about faith, about painful discoveries, and about how sometimes the very people who claim to speak in God's name are the ones who stray furthest from Him. I was born in 1955, right here in Cleveland, Ohio. My childhood smelled like my grandmother's apple pie and sounded like the church bells from the Methodist church on Sunday mornings. Back then, life seemed simpler, more predictable. I met my husband Robert when I was 19, a good man who worked at the Ford plant and had gentle hands that always smelled faintly of motor oil and soap. We married young, as people did in those days. Our little house on Maple Street had blue shutters and a front porch where we'd sit on summer evenings, listening to the neighbors' children playing in their yards. The sound of ice cream trucks in the distance, the smell of charcoal grills, the feeling that life stretched ahead of us like an endless, peaceful road. In 1978, when I was 23, our son Ethan was born. He came into the world with the most beautiful blue eyes and a cry that could wake the entire neighborhood. I remember holding him for the first time, feeling his tiny heartbeat against my chest, thinking that this was what heaven must feel like. Robert would come home from his shift and spend hours just watching Ethan sleep, this look of pure wonder on his face. "He's going to be something special, Mary," he'd whisper, afraid to wake our little miracle. By the time Ethan was 3, our life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings started with the sound of the coffee percolator, Ethan's footsteps running down the hallway, and Robert reading the newspaper at our kitchen table. I'd pack Robert's lunch in the same blue cooler every day, 2 sandwiches, an apple, and a thermos of coffee. Simple pleasures that felt like everything. It was a Saturday morning in 1982 when 2 well-dressed women knocked on our door. I was in the kitchen making pancakes for Ethan when I heard the doorbell. The older woman, probably in her 50s, had perfectly styled gray hair and wore a navy dress that reached just below her knees. The younger one, maybe my age, had kind eyes and a smile that immediately put me at ease. "Good morning," the older woman said. "I'm Sister Margaret, and this is Sister Ruth. We're here to share some wonderful news about God's kingdom." Something about their confidence, their genuine warmth, sparked my curiosity. I'd always been spiritual, always felt there were questions my Methodist upbringing couldn't quite answer. When they asked if I'd be interested in a free Bible study, I found myself saying yes. "We'd love to show you truths from the Bible that most churches don't teach," Sister Ruth said, her voice filled with conviction. That Tuesday afternoon marked the beginning of what I thought would be the most important journey of my life. They arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, carrying colorful books and a well-worn Bible. I served coffee and homemade cookies, and we sat around my dining room table as they opened a book called "The Truth Shall Make You Free." For the first time, someone was explaining the Bible in a way that made perfect sense. Paradise on earth, no more death, no more suffering. Ethan sat nearby, coloring quietly, occasionally looking up when they showed me pictures of lions playing with lambs, children hugging wild animals in a beautiful garden setting. "This is what God promises for people who serve Him faithfully," Sister Margaret explained, pointing to an illustration of families reunited in paradise. Week after week, they returned. Robert was skeptical at first, but gradually he began joining our studies. When they explained about the coming kingdom, about how God would soon end all suffering and create a perfect world, I saw something light up in his eyes. "It makes sense, Mary," he told me one evening after they'd left. "More sense than anything I ever heard in church." Within 6 months, we were attending meetings at the Kingdom Hall 3 times a week. The building was simple but immaculate. Rows of chairs facing a small stage, walls decorated only with a few carefully chosen pictures. Everything was orderly, quiet, respectful. It felt sacred. That's where we met the Morrison family. Elder Thomas Morrison, his wife Susan, and their 2 young children. Elder Morrison was a man in his early 50s, always impeccably dressed, with an air of quiet authority that commanded respect. When he spoke during meetings, you could hear a pin drop. "Brother Morrison really has God's spirit," I whispered to Robert after one particularly moving talk about Bible prophecy. Our life transformed completely. No more birthday celebrations, no Christmas, no Halloween. We stopped associating with relatives who wouldn't accept the truth. I lost childhood friends who thought I'd become fanatical. But it felt right, because I believed I was on the path to eternal life. The organization taught us that the world was controlled by Satan, and only Jehovah's Witnesses would survive Armageddon. In 1984, Robert and I were baptized in a temporary pool set up at a circuit assembly. Elder Morrison performed my baptism, and when I emerged from that water, I felt reborn, absolutely certain I now belonged to God's chosen people. Our routine became intense but purposeful. Tuesday night meetings, Thursday night meetings, Sunday morning meetings. Saturday mornings were for door-to-door preaching. Every aspect of our lives revolved around the organization's schedule, and we loved it. But then came 1987, and everything changed. Ethan was 9 years old, bright and curious, always asking questions about everything he saw. He'd started having what seemed like minor health issues: fatigue, pale skin, occasional nosebleeds. I thought it was just growing pains, the normal challenges of childhood. Then one morning in March, I found him collapsed in the bathroom. His lips were almost white, his breathing shallow. Robert and I rushed him to Cleveland General Hospital, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "Your son has severe anemia," Dr. Patterson told us after running tests. "His blood count is dangerously low. We need to perform a blood transfusion immediately." The words hit me like a physical blow. Blood transfusion. In all our Bible studies, in countless Watchtower articles, we'd learned that accepting blood violated God's law. Acts 15:29 was burned into my memory. Abstain from blood. Is there any other way?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Dr. Patterson's expression grew grave. "Mrs. Collins, without a transfusion, your son's condition is life-threatening. We're talking about hours, not days." I looked at Ethan, lying in that hospital bed, so small and pale, and felt the weight of everything I believed pressing down on me. Elder Morrison's words echoed in my mind from a recent meeting. "Better to die faithful than to live impure in Jehovah's eyes." The decision I made in that hospital room would haunt me for the rest of my life. I signed the paper refusing the blood transfusion, my hand trembling as I wrote my name. Robert stood beside me, his face pale but resolute. We believed we were choosing eternal life for our son, even if it meant losing his earthly life. "We're doing the right thing, Mary," he whispered, but I could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. Elder Morrison arrived within hours of our call. He was accompanied by Elder James Fletcher, a younger man in his 30s with steel-gray eyes and an unwavering expression. They found us in the family waiting room, clutching each other and our Bibles. "Brother and Sister Collins," Elder Morrison said, placing a firm hand on Robert's shoulder. "We're here to support you through this test of faith. Jehovah sees your loyalty, and he will remember it." Elder Fletcher opened his Bible to Hebrews 11:35, reading aloud. "Women received their dead, raised to life again, but other men were tortured, not accepting the ransom, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Your son will have the opportunity for a perfect resurrection in the new system," he explained with absolute certainty. "This temporary suffering is nothing compared to eternal life in paradise." But as the hours passed and Ethan grew weaker, my certainty began to crack. I watched the medical staff moving with increasing urgency, their faces grave. Dr. Patterson pulled me aside multiple times, pleading with me to reconsider. "Mrs. Collins, your son is dying," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Please, let us save him." Each time, I looked toward the elders for strength, and each time they reinforced the same message. Faithfulness to Jehovah's laws was more important than preserving life in this corrupt system. The contradiction in my heart grew unbearable. How could a loving God want a mother to watch her child die? How could refusing to save a life be the right choice? But every time these thoughts surfaced, I pushed them down, believing they were Satan's attempts to weaken my faith. Ethan was conscious for most of those 3 days. In his innocence, he didn't understand why the doctors seemed so worried, why his parents looked so frightened. He trusted us completely, and that trust felt like a knife in my chest. "Mommy, why are you crying?" he asked on the second day, his small hand reaching for mine. "Jehovah loves you very much, sweetheart," I managed to say, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. He smiled then, that beautiful, trusting smile that had lit up our home for 9 years. "I love Jehovah too, Mommy. Don't be sad." The congregation rallied around us with what they called loving support. Sisters brought food we couldn't eat. Brothers offered prayers that felt increasingly hollow. They spoke of Ethan as though he were already dead, already in Jehovah's memory, waiting for resurrection. "Think of this as a sleep," Sister Margaret told me. "Soon, in the new system, you'll wake him up with a kiss, and he'll be perfect forever." But when I looked at my dying son, I didn't see someone peacefully sleeping toward a better life. I saw a vibrant, intelligent boy whose life was being cut short by rules created by men who would never have to bury their own children. Robert and I took turns sitting by Ethan's bedside, reading him Bible stories about the paradise earth. We told him about the lions and lambs, about playing with pandas and elephants, about never being sick again. His eyes would light up with wonder, and for moments, I could almost believe we were doing the right thing. "Will you and Daddy be there too?" he asked on the final day. "If we're faithful to Jehovah." "Yes," I whispered, though the word faithful had begun to taste bitter on my tongue. The nurses were angels in human form. They treated Ethan with such tenderness, never once making us feel judged for our decision, though I could see the pain in their eyes. They knew they could save him, and they had to watch him die. Sister Ruth sat with me during those final hours, holding my hand as I held Ethan's. She spoke constantly about Jehovah's wisdom, about how this trial would strengthen my faith, about the glorious reunion waiting in paradise. "Remember Job," she said. "He lost everything but remained faithful, and Jehovah blessed him double." When Ethan's breathing became labored, Robert called for Dr. Patterson one last time. I saw hope flicker in the doctor's eyes, thinking we'd changed our minds. But Robert simply asked if we could have a moment alone with our son. "Of course, Doctor," Patterson said quietly, and I heard something break in his voice. We prayed over Ethan, asking Jehovah to receive his spirit, to remember him in the resurrection. Ethan looked up at us with those beautiful blue eyes, so trusting, so full of love. "I'm not scared, Mommy," he whispered. "Jehovah will take care of me." He died holding our hands, believing with his pure heart that he was going home to God. The monitors went silent, and with them, a piece of my soul died too. Elder Morrison was the first to speak after the doctors confirmed what we already knew. "Ethan has been approved by Jehovah," he said solemnly. "He died faithful, and that faithfulness will be rewarded with perfect life in the new system." The congregation treated us like heroes of faith. At the funeral, which was held at the Kingdom Hall, speaker after speaker praised our loyalty to Jehovah's laws. They spoke of Ethan as an example for other children, as someone who would be among the first to be resurrected when God's kingdom came to earth. "Brother and Sister Collins have shown us what true faith looks like," the circuit overseer announced to the packed hall. "In a world that values temporary life over eternal principles, they chose to honor Jehovah even in their deepest grief." But sitting in that front row, looking at the small casket that held my entire world, those words felt like mockery. The praise felt like salt in an open wound. Everyone spoke of gain, of blessing, of reward, but all I felt was loss. Devastating, complete, irreversible loss. In the weeks that followed, the congregation expected us to return to normal, to attend meetings with grateful hearts, to share our experience as a testimony of faith. But I found myself unable to sing the kingdom songs, unable to concentrate during the Bible studies, unable to find comfort in the promises that had once sustained me. "Grief is natural," Elder Morrison counseled during a shepherding visit, "but don't let it turn into bitterness against Jehovah. Remember, this is temporary. Soon in the new system, you'll hold Ethan again." Robert tried to find solace in increased activity. He volunteered for extra duties at the Kingdom Hall, spent more time in door-to-door service, threw himself into Bible study with desperate intensity. But I could see the same doubt in his eyes that was growing in my own heart. "Sometimes I wonder," he started to say one evening, then stopped himself. "Wonder what?" I pressed. "Nothing," he said quickly. "We can't question Jehovah's wisdom." But the questions were already there, growing stronger each day. How could a loving God demand such a choice? How could saving a life be wrong? How could an organization that claimed to speak for God feel so cold, so calculating in the face of genuine human suffering? The first crack in my faith came when I overheard two elders discussing our situation after a meeting. They were standing near the literature counter, speaking in low voices, but their words carried clearly across the empty hall. "The Collins case will make an excellent experience for the Circuit Assembly," Elder Fletcher was saying. "Nothing demonstrates loyalty to Jehovah's laws like choosing principle over emotion. An excellent experience." That's what my son's death had become. A teaching tool, a demonstration, a story to inspire others to make the same devastating choice. The months following Ethan's death became a slow descent into a darkness I had never imagined possible. Our house on Maple Street, once filled with the sound of a child's laughter, now echoed with silence so profound it felt like a living thing. His bedroom remained exactly as he'd left it. Superhero posters on the walls, toy cars scattered across the floor, his favorite stuffed elephant sitting on the bed as if waiting for him to return. Robert threw himself deeper into organization activities, accepting every assignment, volunteering for every opportunity to speak or serve. He became what the elders called a spiritual man, but I could see the hollowness behind his increased dedication. We rarely spoke about Ethan anymore, as if mentioning his name might shatter what little faith we were desperately trying to hold on to. "Brother Collins is an excellent example," I heard Elder Morrison tell another elder after a Thursday night meeting. "Look how he's used his trial to draw closer to Jehovah." But when Robert came home from these meetings, he would sit in his chair and stare at nothing for hours. Sometimes I'd catch him holding one of Ethan's toy cars, turning it over and over in his hands like a prayer bead. The organization praised his spiritual progress, but I knew my husband was slowly dying inside. The congregation's response to our loss followed a predictable pattern. For the first few weeks, sisters brought casseroles and offered gentle condolences. Brothers stopped by to check on us, to offer encouraging words from the Bible. But as time passed, the visits became less frequent, the mentions of Ethan more rare. "Time heals all wounds," Sister Margaret assured me during one of her increasingly brief visits. "Soon this will all be just a memory, and you'll be able to focus on serving Jehovah with full joy again." But time wasn't healing anything. Time was revealing the terrible reality of what we'd done, stripping away the spiritual euphoria that had temporarily numbed the pain. Each morning I woke up and remembered anew that my son was gone, that I had chosen to let him die, that I would never hear his voice again in this life. The breaking point came during a circuit assembly in the fall of 1987. We were sitting in the convention center, surrounded by thousands of other Jehovah's Witnesses, listening to talks about loyalty and faithfulness. The circuit overseer, a stern man in his 60s named Brother Hendricks, was delivering a talk about maintaining integrity under trial. "Sometimes," he announced from the platform, his voice echoing through the large hall, "Jehovah tests our devotion by asking us to make difficult choices. I want to share with you the inspiring example of Brother and Sister Collins from the Cleveland congregation." My blood ran cold. I gripped Robert's hand so tightly that he winced, but I couldn't let go. Around us, thousands of people leaned forward to hear our story, our tragedy transformed into a demonstration of faith. "When their young son needed a blood transfusion," Brother Hendricks continued, "these faithful parents chose to obey Jehovah's law rather than the wisdom of this world. Their son died faithful to God's standards, and they can have complete confidence that he will be among the first to be resurrected in the new system." The applause was thunderous. Thousands of people were clapping for our decision to let our child die. I felt physically sick, but I forced myself to smile and nod as people around us patted our shoulders and whispered words of admiration. "What courage," an older sister behind us whispered. What faith! But all I could think was, what madness! What unthinkable madness that a room full of people could celebrate the death of a 9-year-old boy. After the assembly, dozens of people approached us to express their appreciation for our fine example. Parents told us they hoped they would have the same courage if faced with a similar test. Young people said our story strengthened their resolve to put Jehovah first in all things. You're like modern-day Abrahams, one enthusiastic young brother told us, willing to sacrifice what you love most for Jehovah. That night, in our hotel room, I finally broke. The weight of what we'd done, of what it had been transformed into, crushed whatever remained of my ability to maintain the facade of faithful acceptance. "Robert," I whispered in the darkness, "what have we done?" "Don't," he said quickly. "Don't start questioning now. We did what was right. We followed Jehovah's law." But the questions wouldn't be silenced anymore. Over the following weeks, they multiplied like a cancer in my mind. I found myself studying the Bible with new eyes, reading the verses about blood in their full context, researching the history behind the organization's interpretations. What I discovered shattered the last remnants of my faith in the Watchtower Society. The prohibition on blood transfusions wasn't as clear-cut as they'd taught us. The original biblical commands about blood were given in the context of eating blood or offering it in pagan sacrifices, not medical procedures to save lives. I learned that many Bible scholars interpreted these verses differently, that other Christian denominations didn't see blood transfusions as violating God's law. More disturbing was what I learned about the organization's own history with blood doctrine. The prohibition on transfusions was relatively recent, instituted in the 1940s. Before that, Jehovah's Witnesses could accept blood transfusions without any spiritual consequences. The doctrine had evolved, changed, been refined multiple times over the decades. I began to wonder how many children had died for a doctrine that wasn't even consistent. How many families had been destroyed by interpretations that could be changed by a group of men in Brooklyn. The realization that Ethan might have died for nothing was more than I could bear. I stopped attending meetings regularly, claiming illness or exhaustion. When elders called to check on me, I gave polite but distant responses. The fire of zealous faith that had once burned so brightly in my heart had been extinguished, replaced by a cold emptiness that frightened me. Sister Ruth noticed my absence first. She appeared at my door one Tuesday afternoon, her expression a mixture of concern and mild disapproval. "Mary, we've missed you at the meetings," she said, settling into my living room as if nothing had changed. "Are you struggling with discouragement?" "I'm struggling with questions," I answered honestly, and immediately saw her expression shift. "What kind of questions?" Her voice became cautious, guarded. "Questions about blood, about whether we really understood what the Bible was saying, about whether—" "Sister Collins," she interrupted firmly, "these are dangerous thoughts. Satan uses our grief to make us question Jehovah's clear direction. The faithful and discreet slave has explained these matters thoroughly. We don't need to understand everything. We need to trust." But trust was exactly what I couldn't do anymore. Trust in men who had never held a dying child in their arms, who had never had to choose between a religious doctrine and their child's life, who sat in comfortable offices making rules that other people's children would die for. I started researching more intensively, using the public library, reading books the organization had never mentioned, seeking perspectives they had never shared. I learned about families who had left the Jehovah's Witnesses, about former members who questioned the same doctrines I was questioning. The more I learned, the more I realized how carefully controlled our information had been. We'd been taught to trust only Watchtower publications, to view any outside source as potentially dangerous, influenced by Satan. But when I finally looked beyond those narrow boundaries, I found scholars, theologians, and sincere Christians who had very different understandings of the same Bible verses. Robert grew increasingly alarmed by my research. He found books hidden in my bedroom, saw websites bookmarked on the computer we'd recently purchased. "Mary, this is apostasy," he said, his voice filled with genuine fear. "You're reading material from opposers. This is exactly how people fall away from the truth." "What if it's not the truth?" I asked him quietly. "What if we were wrong about the blood issue? What if Ethan died for nothing?" The look of horror on his face told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't ready to face these questions. He might never be ready. The organization had taught us that questioning their teachings was equivalent to questioning God himself, and that programming ran deeper than logic or evidence. Our marriage began to fracture along these fault lines. Robert increased his meeting attendance, volunteered for more responsibilities, surrounded himself with more devoted witnesses. I withdrew further, spending hours reading and thinking and grieving, not just for Ethan, but for the life we'd built on what I now suspected was a foundation of lies. The elders scheduled a shepherding call in early 1988. Elder Morrison and Elder Fletcher arrived on a cold February evening, their expressions grave. They sat in my living room, the same room where I'd first learned about Paradise Earth, where I'd first believed I'd found the truth. "Sister Collins," Elder Morrison began solemnly, "we're concerned about your spiritual welfare. Your meeting attendance has declined significantly, and we've heard reports that you've been researching questionable material." "I'm trying to understand," I said simply. "I'm trying to make sense of what happened to my son." "The understanding comes from Jehovah through his faithful organization," Elder Fletcher interjected. "Individual research outside of our publications leads to confusion and apostasy. The faithful and discreet slave provides all the spiritual food we need. But what if they're wrong?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Both elders stiffened. Elder Morrison leaned forward, his voice taking on a warning tone. "Sister Collins, that kind of thinking is very dangerous. If you can't accept the organization's guidance on these matters, you may need to consider whether you truly want to be one of Jehovah's Witnesses." The ultimatum was clear: submit without question or face disfellowshipping, complete shunning by everyone I'd known for the past 16 years. Lose not just my faith, but my entire social world, my community, many of my remaining relationships. As I looked at these men sitting in my living room, men who had never known the pain of watching their child die, men who spoke with such certainty about matters of life and death, I realized I'd already made my choice. The truth, the real truth, mattered more than belonging. My son's memory deserved more than blind obedience to human interpretations. And somewhere, in the deepest part of my heart, I knew that a God of love would never have wanted Ethan to die. The meeting with the elders ended with an ultimatum that would define the rest of my life. Elder Morrison's words echoed in the silence of my living room long after they'd left. "Sister Collins, you have 2 weeks to decide whether you want to remain one of Jehovah's Witnesses. We'll schedule another visit to hear your decision. 2 weeks to choose between everything I'd believed for 16 years and the truth that was slowly crystallizing in my heart. 2 weeks to decide whether to submit to an organization that had cost me my son or face complete isolation from the only community I'd known as an adult." That night, I sat in Ethan's room for hours, surrounded by his toys and books, his smell still faintly lingering on his pillow. I picked up his favorite bedtime story, a book about Noah's Ark that we'd read together countless times, where all the animals lived peacefully together after the flood. "Mommy, will it really be like that in paradise?" he had asked me just months before he died. "Yes, sweetheart," I had answered with absolute certainty. "Jehovah promises it will be." Now, holding that same book, I felt the weight of every promise I'd made him based on teachings I no longer believed. Had I filled his last days with false hopes? Had I comforted him with lies? Robert found me there at 2 a.m, tears streaming down my face. "Mary, come to bed," he said gently, but I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "You can't keep torturing yourself like this." "Robert," I whispered, not looking up from the book, "what if we killed our son for nothing?" The silence stretched between us like a chasm. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Don't say that. Please don't ever say that." But the words were out, hanging in the air like a confession. We had killed our son. Not directly, not with our own hands, but through a choice we'd made based on interpretations of ancient texts by men we'd never met, men who would never have to live with the consequences of their teachings. The next morning, I called the hospital and asked to speak with Dr. Patterson. He remembered me immediately, and his voice carried a gentleness that brought fresh tears to my eyes. "Mrs. Collins, how can I help you?" "Doctor, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. If we had allowed the blood transfusion, would Ethan have lived? The pause felt eternal. Mrs. Collins, he said finally, your son had an excellent chance of full recovery. The anemia was severe but treatable. With proper medical intervention, he could have lived a completely normal life. I thanked him and hung up the phone, then sat in my kitchen and wept until no more tears would come. My son had died for an interpretation of Scripture that wasn't even universally accepted among Christians. He had died because I'd been taught to fear the judgment of an organization more than I feared losing my child. Over the next few days, I made a series of phone calls that felt like saying goodbye to my entire life. I spoke with my mother, who had become a witness after I did, and my sister Ruth, who had studied for years without baptizing, but supported the organization's teachings. Mary, think about what you're doing, my mother pleaded. You're going to throw away eternal life because you're emotional about Ethan's death. He died faithful. Don't dishonor his sacrifice by turning your back on the truth. Mom, I said quietly, what if it's not the truth? What if we've been wrong about everything? That's Satan talking, she said firmly. I can't listen to this apostasy. If you're determined to leave Jehovah's organization, then you're choosing to leave your family too. The conversation with my sister was even more painful. Ruth had always been my closest confidant, the one person who understood my spiritual journey because she'd traveled part of it with me. I can't follow you down this path, Mary, she said, tears in her voice. I know you're hurting, but you're making a terrible mistake. When you come to your senses, I hope it won't be too late. These conversations confirmed what I already knew. Leaving the organization meant losing almost everyone I'd loved and depended on for nearly 2 decades. But staying meant accepting that my son had died for a lie, and that was something I simply couldn't do. 3 days before the elders' return visit, I received an unexpected phone call. The voice was unfamiliar but warm, belonging to a woman who identified herself as Patricia Chen. Mrs. Collins, I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from someone who thought we should talk. I'm a former Jehovah's Witness, and I heard about your situation through mutual friends. I don't know what to say, I stammered, looking around as if the elders might suddenly appear to catch me talking to an apostate. You don't have to say anything, Patricia said gently. I just want you to know that there are people who understand what you're going through, and you're not alone. She told me about a support group for former witnesses that met monthly in a town about an hour away. People who had left for various reasons, doctrinal disagreements, personal conscience issues, situations involving family members who had died because of organizational policies. I lost my daughter too, she said quietly. Not the same circumstances as yours, but the organization's policies played a role. I know the guilt you're carrying, and I know how isolated you must feel. That phone call was like oxygen to someone who'd been drowning. For the first time in months, I felt like I wasn't crazy, wasn't the only person in the world who had started to question teachings that everyone around me accepted without hesitation. When the elders returned for my answer, I was ready. Robert sat beside me on our couch, his face pale and resigned. He'd already told me he wouldn't fight my decision, but he couldn't make the same choice. His faith, wounded as it was, remained stronger than his doubts. Elder Morrison opened his Bible, his expression formal and cold. Sister Collins, we're here to discuss your spiritual welfare. Have you reconsidered your position regarding the organization and its teachings? I looked at these 2 men who had influenced so many crucial decisions in my life, who had counseled me through my pregnancy, my child-rearing questions, my marriage challenges, and ultimately, my son's death. They had seemed so wise, so connected to God, so certain of divine approval. Now I saw them differently. They were men, flawed and limited like everyone else, but clothed in an authority that demanded unquestioning obedience. They spoke for God, they claimed, but they had never heard His voice any more clearly than I had. Elder Morrison, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. I've spent weeks praying and studying and thinking. I've read the Bible without Watchtower publications, filtering my understanding. I've researched the history of blood doctrine and discovered it's changed multiple times over the decades. His expression hardened. Sister Collins, independent research leads to apostasy. The faithful and discreet slave provides all necessary understanding of Scripture. But what if the faithful and discreet slave is wrong? I asked. What if they've been wrong about blood? What if my son died because of a misinterpretation of Scripture? Elder Fletcher leaned forward, his voice sharp. Sister Collins, you're speaking like an apostate. Are you prepared to reject Jehovah's organization based on your personal feelings? I'm prepared to reject an organization that teaches parents to let their children die, I said clearly. I'm prepared to reject teachings that put institutional loyalty above human life. I'm prepared to follow my conscience instead of your rules. The silence that followed felt like the moment before lightning strikes. Both elders exchanged glances, and I knew my fate was sealed. In that case, Elder Morrison said formally, you leave us no choice. Your attitude shows that you no longer want to be one of Jehovah's Witnesses. We'll be announcing your disfellowshipping at the next service meeting. Robert's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the room. Even though we'd known this was coming, hearing the words spoken aloud felt like a death sentence. You realize, Elder Fletcher added, that this means your family and friends who are faithful witnesses will no longer be able to associate with you. You're choosing to be cut off from God's people. No, I said, standing up, feeling stronger than I had in months. You're cutting me off because I refuse to accept that my son had to die. I'm choosing truth over fear, conscience over conformity. If that makes me an apostate in your eyes, then so be it. After they left, Robert and I sat in silence for a long time. Finally, he reached for my hand. I can't go with you, he whispered. I want to, but I can't. This is all I know, all I have left. I know, I said, squeezing his hand. I understand. 3 days later, at the Thursday night meeting I didn't attend, Elder Morrison announced to the congregation, Mary Collins is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. With those words, I ceased to exist in the only world I'd known as an adult. But for the first time since Ethan's death, I felt like I could breathe. The announcement of my disfellowshipping rippled through my world like a stone thrown into still water. By Friday morning, the shunning had begun. Sister Margaret, who had studied with me for years and had become like a mother figure, walked past me at the grocery store as if I were invisible. Sister Ruth, with whom I'd shared countless afternoons of Bible study and friendship, turned her face away when our shopping carts nearly collided in the produce section. The silence was deafening. No phone calls, no visits, no acknowledgement of my existence. People who had been in my home dozens of times, who had eaten my cooking and shared their deepest concerns with me, now treated me as if I had died. In their minds, I suppose I had. Robert struggled with the implications of my new status. As my husband, he wasn't required to shun me completely, but associating with me put his own standing in the congregation at risk. He began staying later at work, attending more meetings, accepting every invitation to social gatherings that I could no longer attend. I'm trying to show them I'm still faithful, he explained one evening, avoiding my eyes. Maybe if they see that your decision hasn't affected my loyalty to the organization. You don't have to justify anything to me, I told him. But we both knew our marriage was slowly dissolving. How could it survive when the foundation of our shared life, our faith, our community, our entire social framework had crumbled beneath us? The loneliness was crushing. For 16 years, my calendar had been filled with meetings, service activities, social gatherings with fellow witnesses. Suddenly, my days stretched empty and silent. I would sit in Ethan's room for hours, holding his stuffed elephant, wondering if leaving the organization meant I would never see him again, even in death. The organization taught that only faithful witnesses would be resurrected in the new system. If they were right about that, then my choice to leave had cost me not only my son's life, but any hope of reuniting with him in paradise. The thought was almost enough to drive me back to the Kingdom Hall, to beg for reinstatement regardless of my doubts. But then I remembered Dr. Patterson's words. Your son had an excellent chance of full recovery. Ethan hadn't needed to die at all. The organization's teachings had killed him as surely as any disease, and I couldn't pretend otherwise, no matter how much it hurt to face the truth. 2 weeks after my disfellowshipping, I drove to the support group meeting Patricia Chen had told me about. It was held in the basement of a Methodist church in a small town I'd never visited before. Walking down those stairs felt like descending into another world, one I'd been taught to fear and avoid my entire adult life. There were about 12 people sitting in a circle on folding chairs. They ranged in age from their 20s to their 70s, and they all had the same slightly wounded look I'd come to recognize in my own mirror. When Patricia introduced me, several people nodded with understanding rather than pity. "We all know what you're going through," said a man named David who appeared to be in his 50s. "The grief, the confusion, the isolation. It gets better, but it takes time." A woman named Elena, probably around my age, shared her story of leaving after 25 years when she discovered the organization's handling of child abuse cases. Another man, Marcus, had been disfellowshipped for questioning the generation teaching after realizing the promises he'd based his entire life on kept changing. "I gave up college, career opportunities, relationships, all because they taught us the end was so close," Marcus said. "Then they changed the teaching, and suddenly all those sacrifices were for nothing." But it was Sarah's story that broke my heart and gave me hope simultaneously. She had lost her teenage daughter to leukemia after refusing a blood transfusion, just as I had with Ethan. That was 8 years ago, and she still carried the grief like a physical weight. "The guilt almost killed me," she said quietly. "For 3 years after Jessica died, I couldn't get out of bed most days. I kept going to meetings, kept telling everyone how grateful I was for Jehovah's mercy, but inside, I was dying." "What changed?" I asked, needing to know there was a path through the darkness I was experiencing. "Therapy," she said simply. "I found a counselor who understood religious trauma. She helped me realize that questioning harmful teachings wasn't betraying God. It was honoring the conscience He gave me. She helped me understand that a loving God wouldn't want any parent to watch their child die unnecessarily. The idea of therapy had never occurred to me. In the organization, psychological problems were considered spiritual weaknesses to be prayed away or solved through increased meeting attendance and field service. Professional mental health treatment was viewed with suspicion, another tool of Satan's world designed to undermine faith. But sitting in that circle, surrounded by people who understood my pain without judging my choices, I realized I needed help to navigate the wreckage of my life. The next week, I called Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a therapist Patricia recommended who specialized in religious trauma and cult recovery. Dr. Martinez's office was warm and welcoming, filled with plants and soft lighting that immediately put me at ease. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a gentle manner that reminded me of the nurses who had cared for Ethan in his final days. "Tell me about your son," she said during our first session. And for the first time in months, I was able to speak about Ethan without someone trying to reframe his death as a blessing or a test of faith. I told her about his laugh, his curiosity, his trust in me even as he lay dying. I told her about the decision I'd made, and the community I'd lost, and the marriage that was falling apart. I cried until I thought there were no tears left, and she simply listened without judgment or advice. "Grief is complex," she explained. "You're mourning not just your son, but the beliefs that gave your life meaning, the community that provided your identity, the future you'd planned based on those beliefs. It's like losing everything at once." Through therapy, I began to understand that my questioning wasn't disloyalty to God, but a natural response to experiencing something that contradicted everything I'd been taught. A loving God wouldn't demand the death of children. A true religion wouldn't require parents to choose between their faith and their child's life. "What if, Dr. Martinez suggested gently, your love for Ethan and your refusal to accept his unnecessary death is actually the most spiritual response you could have? What if questioning teachings that cause harm is exactly what a person of conscience should do?" The idea was revolutionary. For so long, I'd been taught that questioning was weakness, that doubt was sin, that submission to organizational authority was equivalent to obedience to God. But what if the opposite was true? What if thinking for myself, following my conscience, protecting children was what God actually wanted? Meanwhile, my relationship with Robert continued to deteriorate. He was spending more and more time away from home, surrounding himself with people who reinforced his decision to stay in the organization. When we did talk, our conversations were stilted and careful, both of us afraid to say anything that might drive the wedge between us deeper. One evening in late spring, he came home from a meeting with news that felt like another death. "They've asked me to give a talk about loyalty to the organization," he said, unable to meet my eyes. They want me to use our experience as an example of how trials can strengthen faith rather than weaken it. They want you to talk about Ethan's death? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. About our faithfulness during trials. About how we trusted Jehovah's wisdom, even when it was difficult to understand. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd thought possible. They wanted to use our tragedy, our son's death, as propaganda to encourage other parents to make the same devastating choice. And Robert was going to let them. You can't do this, I pleaded. You can't let them turn Ethan's death into a recruiting tool. Mary, it's an assignment from the elders. I can't refuse. Yes, you can. You can walk away just like I did. You can choose our son's memory over their approval. But I could see in his eyes that he couldn't. The organization had become his lifeline, his only remaining source of meaning and community. Without it, he would have nothing left but grief and questions he wasn't ready to face. That night, I called a lawyer. If Robert was going to publicly exploit our son's death to promote the very teachings that had killed him, then I couldn't remain married to him. The divorce papers were filed within a week. I'm sorry, I told him as he stared at the legal documents. I can't watch you turn Ethan into a symbol for a cause that cost him his life. Robert moved out the following month. Our house on Maple Street, once filled with love and laughter and faith, became a tomb of memories. I would walk through the empty rooms, remembering birthday parties we could no longer celebrate, Christmas mornings that would never come again, family dinners around a table now set for one. But slowly, gradually, I began to rebuild. The support group became my lifeline, providing the community I'd lost when I was disfellowshipped. Dr. Martinez helped me process not just my grief over Ethan's death, but my anger at the system that had deceived me for so long. I started reading voraciously, books about religion, philosophy, science, history that I'd been taught to avoid. I discovered that the Bible itself was far more complex and nuanced than the black and white interpretations I'd been fed. I learned about higher criticism, textual analysis, historical context, and began to understand that sincere, intelligent people could read the same scriptures and reach very different conclusions. Most importantly, I began to distinguish between faith in God and faith in an organization. The two weren't the same thing, despite what I'd been taught. I could believe in a loving creator without accepting every interpretation imposed by a group of men in Brooklyn. I could trust my conscience without rejecting spirituality entirely. The first anniversary of Ethan's death was approaching, and I knew I needed to mark it somehow. The organization taught that mourning the dead was pointless since they would be resurrected soon, but I needed to honor my son's memory in a way that felt authentic and healing. I decided to plant a garden in our backyard, a memorial garden filled with flowers that would bloom every spring, a reminder that beauty could grow from even the deepest grief. As I worked the soil with my hands, I felt closer to Ethan than I had in any Kingdom Hall, closer to God than I had in any organized worship service. This was my new faith, not built on fear of organizational disapproval, but on love for my son and trust in a God who surely mourned with me over his unnecessary death. 25 years have passed since I walked away from the Kingdom Hall, and I'm sitting now in the same kitchen where I first welcomed those two women who changed the course of my life. The morning light streams through windows I've decorated with plants that would have been forbidden then. Wind chimes that sing softly in the breeze, crystals that catch the sunlight and scatter rainbows across my table. The house on Maple Street looks different now. The walls that once displayed only Watchtower publications are covered with photographs of the life I've built in freedom. Pictures of my work with trauma survivors, images from my travels to conferences around the world, smiling faces of the chosen family I've created from fellow survivors, and new friends who accept me exactly as I am. Ethan's room has been transformed into an office where I write and counsel others who are escaping high-control religious groups. His stuffed elephant sits on my desk, a gentle reminder of the love that motivated every choice I've made since his death. Sometimes people ask if it's difficult to be surrounded by those memories, but I've learned that love doesn't diminish with time. It transforms, deepens, becomes a source of strength rather than only sorrow. The divorce from Robert was finalized in 1989. He remarried within the organization 2 years later, choosing a faithful sister who would never question the teachings that had shaped his worldview. We never spoke again after the legal proceedings, though I heard through mutual acquaintances that he eventually stopped giving talks about our experience. Perhaps some part of him couldn't continue to celebrate what we'd lost. My mother maintained her shunning until her death in 2003. Even on her deathbed, she refused to see me, believing that associating with me would cost her salvation. My sister Ruth left the organization in 1995 after her own daughter was born, with a condition that would have required blood products. Unlike me, she chose her child's life over organizational loyalty, and we reconciled beautifully before her passing 5 years ago. "I should have listened to you," she told me during one of our long conversations in her final months. "I should have had the courage to question earlier." "We all did the best we could with the information we had," I assured her. "The important thing is that your daughter lived." The support group that saved my sanity in those early years evolved into a formal organization. We now have chapters in 12 states, a website with resources for people leaving high-control groups, and a 24-hour helpline staffed by trained volunteers who understand the unique challenges of religious trauma recovery. Dr. Martinez became more than my therapist. She became a collaborator in developing treatment protocols specifically for cult survivors. Together, we've written articles for psychological journals and spoken at conferences about the particular type of grief that comes from losing one's entire worldview, community, and sense of identity simultaneously. "Your story has helped thousands of people," she often reminds me when I struggle with moments of doubt about my choices. "Ethan's death wasn't meaningless if it prevents other children from dying for the same reasons." I've testified before legislative committees about religious exemptions for medical treatment, sharing Ethan's story in the hope that laws might change to better protect children. Some states have modified their statutes because of cases like ours, though progress is frustratingly slow when religious freedom and parental rights intersect with child welfare. The work is difficult but necessary. I receive letters almost daily from parents facing similar decisions, from teenagers questioning the beliefs they've inherited, from elderly people who've spent decades in high-control groups and wonder if it's too late to start over. "Dear Mrs. Collins," one recent letter began, "I'm a 17-year-old Jehovah's Witness who found your story online. My little brother needs surgery that might require blood, and my parents are preparing to refuse it just like you did. I can't let them watch him die. Can you help me?" These letters break my heart and give me purpose simultaneously. Each one represents a life that might be saved, a family that might be preserved, a tragedy that might be prevented because someone was brave enough to share their story. I've remarried, a gentleman named Thomas who was raised Catholic but left organized religion long before we met. He understands my spiritual journey without trying to direct it, supports my work without needing to be the center of my world. We have a quiet, comfortable life filled with books and gardens and meaningful work. Thomas never knew Ethan, but he honors his memory in countless small ways. He helped me plant the memorial garden that now bursts with color every spring. He listens patiently when I talk about my son, never suggesting I should move on or let go. He understands that some losses change you permanently, and that integration rather than forgetting is the path to healing. My faith has evolved into something I never could have imagined during my witness years. I believe in a God of love who weeps with grieving parents, who honors conscience over conformity, who is found in acts of compassion rather than organizational structures. I attend a small Episcopal church where questions are welcomed, where doubt is seen as part of faith's journey, where children are cherished as precious gifts rather than potential sacrifices to religious doctrine. The church's children's choir performed last Christmas, their voices raised in songs of hope and joy. Watching them, I wondered what kind of man Ethan would have become had he lived. Would he have questioned the beliefs he inherited, as I eventually did? Would he have chosen love over fear, truth over comfort? I like to think he would have grown into someone who protected the vulnerable, who spoke truth to power, who chose compassion over conformity. Sometimes former witnesses contact me, usually through intermediaries, to express regret about my disfellowshipping, or to share that they've started questioning certain teachings themselves. A few have left the organization and credited my story with giving them courage to follow their conscience. These conversations are bittersweet. I'm grateful that others have found freedom, but I mourn the years they lost to fear and control. "Don't you ever wonder if you were wrong?" one former elder asked during a secret phone call. "Don't you worry that you've sacrificed eternal life for temporary comfort?" "I worried about that for years," I told him honestly. But then I realized that a God who would condemn me for refusing to let children die unnecessarily isn't a God worth serving. If following my conscience costs me eternal life, then that's a price I'm willing to pay. The nightmares about Ethan's death have faded, replaced by dreams where he appears as he would be now, a man in his 40s with his father's gentle hands and my stubborn insistence on asking difficult questions. In these dreams, he's proud of the path I chose, grateful that his death sparked questions that might save other children's lives. I wake from these dreams not with sorrow, but with determination to continue the work that gives his death meaning beyond tragedy. Last month, I spoke at a medical conference about religious exemptions and patient advocacy. During the question period, a young doctor asked how medical professionals should handle parents who refuse life-saving treatment for religious reasons. "Love them," I said. "Remember that they believe they're choosing eternal life for their child. They're not monsters. They're people caught in a system that has convinced them that faithfulness requires unthinkable sacrifice. Be patient, be persistent, and be willing to involve authorities when necessary to protect the child." After my presentation, a middle-aged woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "You saved my daughter's life," she said simply. "3 years ago, we were Jehovah's Witnesses, facing the same decision you faced. I read your story online the night before we had to sign the consent forms. Because of your courage in speaking out, my daughter received the blood transfusion she needed. She's 14 now, healthy and strong. Thank you for making sure your son's death wasn't in vain." These moments sustain me when the work feels overwhelming, when the loneliness of being permanently separated from my birth family becomes too heavy to bear. Ethan's death was a tragedy that should never have happened, but it wasn't meaningless if it prevents other tragedies from occurring. As I finish writing this story, the sun is setting behind the oak tree in my backyard, the same tree where Ethan used to swing when he was small. The memorial garden is dormant now, waiting for spring's renewal. But I know that with the returning warmth will come new life, new beauty, new hope. I'm 68 years old now, and I've learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means integrating loss into a life that still has meaning, purpose, and joy. It means choosing love over fear, truth over comfort, conscience over conformity again and again, until those choices become as natural as breathing. If you're reading this story because you're questioning beliefs that others consider unquestionable, if you're facing impossible choices between faith and conscience, if you're wondering whether it's possible to survive the loss of everything you once believed, please know that you're not alone. The path forward isn't easy, but it leads to freedom. The questions that frighten others are the beginning of wisdom. The courage to love more than you fear is the truest expression of faith I've ever known. Ethan has been gone for 37 years now, but his influence on my life continues to grow. He taught me that love is stronger than fear, that truth is more important than comfort, that protecting children matters more than protecting institutions. These are the lessons I carry into whatever years remain to me, the gifts he left that keep on giving, the reason his brief life continues to change the world one saved child at a time. This is a real story, shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us with it. If you also have a story you'd like to share, please write in the comments. We would be very happy to tell your story on our channel.